He woke up gripping a cracked bathroom sink, trapped inside a story's disposable villain. Dean's plan was simple: play the part, collect the payout, vanish before the plot destroyed him the way it destroyed the man who wore this face first. He kept his hands off the billionaire who owned the penthouse. He kept his eyes off the golden boy fate had written in as the real love interest. Somehow he still ended up with both men refusing to let him go, one rewriting his own fortune to keep him, the other quietly admitting he never wanted to leave. So what did Dean actually do to turn two rivals into two men fighting over him? Get cozy, because today's story belongs to Dean, a man who transmigrated straight into a doomed villain's body with one very simple rule: no falling for the male lead. Let's just say that rule didn't survive the first month, so if you've ever set a boundary with someone impossibly attractive and broken it embarrassingly fast, we need to hear about it in the comments. I died the way most underpaid, over-caffeinated corporate drones die in these stories, slumped over a keyboard at 3 in the morning, my heart giving one last pathetic flutter before it simply gave up. No dramatic last words. No flashback montage of a happy childhood. My final coherent thought wasn't about my family, or God, or the meaning of existence. It was pure, petty resentment that I would never find out how my favorite trashy web novel ended. So when I opened my eyes again, I fully expected a sterile hospital ceiling, or maybe the tacky pearly gates my grandmother used to describe. Instead, I was gripping the edges of a cracked porcelain sink, staring at a bathroom mirror that had clearly seen better decades. "Great," I muttered. The voice that came out was raspy and completely unfamiliar. Of every novel I skimmed through during my graveyard shifts, I land in this one, and of every character in it, I get stuck being the disposable villain. The realization didn't arrive like a lightning bolt. It trickled in, memory by memory, like someone slowly refilling a cup I hadn't known was empty. I knew this story. I'd read all 140 chapters of Beautifully Ruined on my phone during dead-end night shifts, half in love with it and half convinced it was going to give me an aneurysm. The male lead was Roman Ashford, sole heir to the Ashford Group, a man built entirely out of tailored suits and unresolved trauma, cold, calculating, ruthless in boardrooms and utterly humorless everywhere else. His parents were old money tyrants who'd spent his entire adult life trying to marry him off to whichever socialite would consolidate the family's shipping empire fastest. To buy himself time, Roman had come up with what he considered a flawless, faintly cruel plan: hire the most inappropriate, most scandalous boyfriend he could find, parade him in front of his parents, and let their horror do the negotiating for him. Enter Dean. The original Dean was the perfect sacrificial lamb for that particular chess game. His mother left when he was 9. His father was a gambling addict who buried them both in debt before disappearing entirely. Dean spent his teenage years dodging loan sharks, getting mocked at school for wearing the same jacket 3 winters in a row, and learning to survive on nothing but spite and instant noodles. He was broke, desperate, and, according to the contract, exactly disreputable enough to horrify a room full of billionaires. When Roman offered him the fake dating deal, the original Dean saw it as a lottery ticket, and then he made the one mistake every side character in a tragedy makes. He fell in love with the man who was only ever supposed to be his paycheck. He tried to seduce Roman. Got clingy, then desperate, then obsessive, threw his whole self into a role that had never once been real, and then, right on schedule, came the plot twist that ruined him. After 11 years abroad, Elliot Hale, Roman's childhood best friend, and the story's actual romantic lead, came home. One look at Elliot under the string lights of some garden party, and Roman supposedly remembered a promise made under a cherry blossom tree when they were 14. He handed Dean a termination check without so much as a goodbye. The original Dean lost his mind, refused the money, stalked Roman, tried to ruin Elliot's reputation out of sheer jealousy. It ended with him strapped to a gurney in a psychiatric hospital, a footnote in someone else's love story. "Yeah," I said to my reflection, smoothing down a head of messy brown hair that wasn't mine yet. Absolutely not. I like my sanity. And more importantly, I like money. My plan was beautifully simple. I would play the gold-digging, wildly unsuitable boyfriend to perfection, because that part, at least, required no acting. I would keep my hands to myself, my heart uninvolved, and my eyes very firmly off Roman Ashford's ridiculous bone structure. I would wait for Elliot Hale to make his grand moonlit return, collect my breakup payout like the professional I intended to be, pay off this body's debts, and retire somewhere with a beach and zero corporate drama. According to the timeline I'd inherited, I'd landed exactly 1 month into the arrangement. Roman and Dean were already living together in his obscenely modern penthouse, technically under one roof, practically in 2 different zip codes. The original Dean had spent that entire month trying every trick in the desperate Roman's handbook, cooking 3-course meals nobody asked for, ironing shirts, scrubbing a kitchen that already had a cleaning service. Roman had noticed. Roman had hated it. He'd seen every gesture for exactly what it was, a boy clawing for a place he didn't belong. I, on the other hand, had noticed something the original Dean apparently never had. The penthouse came with a full-time cleaning crew and a private chef who stopped by 3 times a week. Why on earth would I lift a finger? When Roman came home that evening, he was clearly bracing for the usual performance, Dean hovering by the door, offering to take his briefcase, presenting a home-cooked dinner that would end up untouched in the trash by 9 p.m. Instead, the foyer was empty. The only sound in the entire penthouse was the overproduced, string-heavy score of a Tuesday night soap opera blasting from the living room. Roman rounded the corner in his charcoal suit, expression set to its factory default of icy nothing, and stopped dead. I was horizontal on his 4-figure leather sofa in a pair of sweatpants that had definitely seen better decades, mouthful of fried chicken, a half-empty can of off-brand soda balanced on a coaster like I had some manners. On screen, a woman was slapping her mother-in-law with what appeared to be a fistful of kimchi. I was far too invested to notice a multi-billionaire had entered the room. He cleared his throat. Sharp, deliberate. I blinked, dragged my eyes away from the television with visible reluctance, and gave him a brief, entirely unbothered once-over. "Oh, you're back!" I turned right back to the TV. Roman didn't move. His gaze tracked slowly across the coffee table, the empty takeout boxes, my grease-stained fingers, my complete lack of urgency, like he was auditing a crime scene. In every version of this story, Dean treated him like a god descending from the executive floor. My apathy was, apparently, a data anomaly he had no framework for. "I have something to discuss," he said finally, voice dropping into a low, deliberate register that, I will admit, under oath, to no one, did something unfair to my spine. My study, 1 minute. He didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel and disappeared down the hallway like a man exiting a boardroom, not a living room. I wiped my hands on a paper towel, popped one last piece of chicken into my mouth, and dragged myself off the sofa. His study doors were the kind of heavy mahogany that probably cost more than my rent used to. Roman was already behind his desk when I walked in, reviewing documents, not bothering to look up. "You're late," he said, in a tone that would have made the original Dean apologize 4 separate times. "Sorry," I said, dropping into the chair across from him without waiting to be invited. The drama was at a cliffhanger. Turns out the lead's sister is actually her biological mother. Genuinely unhinged writing. 10 out of 10. He looked up. There was something in his frosty stare I couldn't quite name yet. Irritation, maybe, or the specific confusion of a man used to being hung on every word, suddenly finding himself background noise. "My mother's hosting a benefit gala tomorrow evening," he said, sliding a black folder across the desk. "A stylist will deliver something appropriate. Wear it. Be ready by 7. Understood." I glanced at the folder, then set it aside. "While we're talking business, I want to renegotiate my monthly allowance. You already receive 10 times what your living expenses require." "My father left me an astronomical amount of debt," I said, crossing my legs, perfectly at ease. "And the men currently threatening to break them are only a few missed payments away from actually doing it. Broken legs make it very hard to attend galas and play doting boyfriend, Mr. Ashford. Consider it a matter of protecting your public image." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "So the rumors are true. You really are just a rat looking for a handout." The words landed harder than I expected, not because they hurt me, but because something underneath my ribs flinched that had nothing to do with my own feelings. The lingering residue of a boy who had wanted, more than anything, to be looked at with something other than contempt. I patted that feeling down internally. "Hang in there, buddy. We're getting paid. A rat's got to eat, Mr. Ashford," I said, unbothered, sliding on my most professionally mercenary smile. "You want your parents to think you're dating a disaster? I will give them a performance they'll be discussing at Christmas for the next decade. But premium theater requires a premium fee." He studied me for a long moment, searching my face for the old desperation, the old hunger for his approval. He found nothing but calculated greed, and something in his expression hardened in response. "Fine," he said, pulling a fountain pen from his breast pocket. 50,000, deposited tonight. But remember your place. You're an actor in this arrangement. Nothing more, mister." "Ashford," I said, reaching for the pen and signing the addendum with more flourish than strictly necessary. "You couldn't pay me enough to want more than the cash." I stood, smoothed down my sweatpants, and paused at the door. "Also, did you already order dinner? Because I'm still starving, and since you're footing the household bill, I'd like the Wagyu from downstairs. Actually, make it 2 orders. Growing rats need protein." I slipped out before he could respond, my heart doing a small, undignified dance in my chest, debt shrinking, 50 grand incoming. An ungodly amount of stake on the way. Being a villain so far was not the tragedy the internet made it sound like. The night proved that outrunning the past wasn't going to be that simple. I lay down in the geek's bedroom, half expecting the sleep of the well-fed and financially secure. Instead, a wave of crushing grief hit my chest without warning. Not physical, but suffocating all the same, like drowning from the inside. Memories that weren't mine surfaced with brutal clarity. A 9-year-old Dean on a freezing concrete porch, watching his mother's taillights disappear down the street. A 13-year-old Dean locked in a school bathroom stall, ribs aching from a beating he hadn't reported because reporting it never helped. A 16-year-old Dean shivering under one thin blanket because the gas company had shut them off in January, listening to his father's drunken shouting through the wall until the noise finally, mercifully, went quiet. I hit the floor before I registered I was crying, curling into myself on the hardwood, gasping for air that wouldn't come fast enough. "You poor kid," I whispered into the dark, sobbing into my own knees. "No wonder you fell for the first person who threw you a crumb of attention. No wonder you unraveled." I stayed on that floor for the better part of an hour and let the body finally grieve a childhood it had never been allowed to grieve properly. Not once. Not without being hit or abandoned mid-tier. I didn't fight it. I just let it move through me, standing custodian over a decade of pain that belonged to someone I now, somehow, also was. When it finally passed, something had lifted. I splashed cold water on my face, looked myself dead in the eye, and made a quiet vow. Whatever else happened, this body was going to get the safe, peaceful, financially secure life it had never once been given. Free of corporate overlords, free of emotionally stunted billionaires, free of anyone who could hurt it ever again. I meant it. I really did. It just turned out I was terrible at keeping that particular promise. Before the gala, before the wine, before any of it, there was the small matter of learning how to survive my new life without accidentally getting arrested, disowned, or fired from a job that technically didn't have a title. The penthouse staff, I discovered over the following days, were a small, well-trained, and deeply amused audience to whatever this new version of Dean was turning into. Priya, the housekeeper who came twice a week even though the place never seemed to get dirty, took one look at me eating cereal directly out of the box on the kitchen island and said, without missing a beat, the last one apologized to me for existing. "You, I like better." The chef, a soft-spoken man named Marcus, who showed up Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays with ingredients that cost more than my old monthly rent, nearly dropped a tray the first time I asked him, completely seriously, whether he could make it spicier, like genuinely dangerous spicy, not rich people spicy. He could, he did. It became a standing order. Roman's driver, a stone-faced man named Felix who I was fairly sure had a body count, started leaving a specific brand of orange soda in the car's cup holder without being asked after I mentioned it once, in passing, on day 4. When I asked him why, he said only, "Mr. Ashford asked what you liked," and refused to elaborate further, which was somehow more alarming than if he'd said nothing at all. It became clear fast that Roman Ashford ran his household the way he ran his company, quietly, efficiently, and with an unsettling amount of attention paid to details he pretended not to care about. I found this out the hard way one morning when I mentioned, half joking, that the guest bathroom's water pressure was criminally weak. By that evening, there was a plumber in my bathroom and an apology note on the counter that read in sharp, economical handwriting, "Should be fixed. Let staff know if anything else is inadequate." "Are inadequate," I muttered, reading it over breakfast. "Who talks like that?" "Billionaires," Priya said, Without looking up from the counter, she was absolutely not cleaning because it was already spotless. It's a whole personality. I kept careful mental notes during that first week, not because I was falling for any of it, obviously, but because a good con artist studies the mark. That's all this was. Reconnaissance. The fact that I found myself smiling into my orange soda every time Felix wordlessly restocked the car was, I told myself, purely incidental. The next evening, the performance began in earnest. In the car on the way to the gala, the shift in our dynamic was obvious even to Roman's driver. The original Dean would have sat pressed to Roman's side, hand on his knee, chattering nervously to fill silence. I sat on the opposite end of the leather bench, 6 inches from my face, scrolling cat videos like Roman was a particularly well-dressed Uber driver. He kept glancing over, jaw tight, fingers tapping an irritated rhythm against his thigh. I ignored him completely. I had a job to do. The ballroom, when we arrived, was the kind of over-decorated opulence that made my working-class instincts itch. Ice sculptures, chandeliers the size of small cars, a string quartet playing something nobody was actually listening to. The moment we spotted Roman's parents across the room, I flipped a switch. I looped my arm through his, leaned my full weight against his side, and gazed up at him with the kind of wide, adoring eyes usually reserved for golden retrievers, greeting their owner after a long day. His mother looked like she'd bitten into a lemon. His father went the color of the wine list. "Mrs. Ashford," I said sweetly, grabbing her wrist to admire her bracelet. "This is stunning. Roman, sweetheart, you have to get me one exactly like this. My wrists have been so lonely." Roman tightened his arm around my waist and chuckled. Actually chuckled. Like this was the funniest thing he'd heard all week. "Of course, sweetheart, the whole collection if you'd like." His mother made a small choking sound. Feeling bold, I pouted at a passing waiter's tray of canapés. "Roman, darling, feed me. I just had my nails done." He raised an eyebrow, something dark and interested flickering behind the ice. "You want me to feed you?" "Yes, honey. Try to keep up." I opened my mouth. His gaze locked onto mine as he pressed the food to my lips, thumb brushing lingeringly against my chin, and an entirely unwelcome jolt of electricity shot straight down my spine. I chewed, determined not to react, and turned brightly to his father. "Mr. Ashford, I heard the family's shipping division just closed on that downtown property. Roman and I were just saying the penthouse deed would make the sweetest early wedding gift." The nearby socialites gasped audibly. His parents froze in matching horror. My gold digger performance was, if I said so myself, flawless. But Roman was laughing beside me, soft, entertained, genuinely amused instead of irritated, and a cold sweat broke out along the back of my neck. That's not the script. He's supposed to hate this. The moment we were alone in the car afterward, I dropped the act instantly, pulling my arm free like his suit was coated in something contagious and sliding back to my side of the seat. I pulled out my phone and let out a loud, exhausted groan. His expression hardened again, the warmth vanishing as fast as it had appeared. Back at the penthouse, I kicked off my shoes and turned toward my room. "Done for the night, Dean." His voice stopped me cold. He crossed the foyer, eyes fixed on me with an intensity I didn't have a name for yet. "Is this your new strategy? Playing hard to get?" I turned around, genuinely baffled. Then I threw my head back and groaned. "Oh my God, rich people are exhausting." I rubbed the bridge of my nose. "Listen very carefully, Roman. I don't want you. I don't want your cold personality, your toxic family, or your high society drama. I want your money. That's the whole list. I want to clear this body's debts, buy a small apartment with heated floors, and eat something expensive every night without checking a price tag. You're my employer. I'm your employee. Let's keep it exactly that simple." I turned and walked away before he could answer. I didn't see the way he stood rooted to that spot for a long time afterward, staring at the empty hallway where I'd disappeared, something dangerous and possessive lighting up behind his eyes. Something shifted after that night, and I couldn't tell you exactly why. Roman, who in every previous version of this story vanished for days at a time, hotels, late nights at the office, anywhere that wasn't home, started coming back every single evening precisely on schedule. Worse, he started invading my personal space. Whenever I settled onto the sofa with takeout and my nightly dose of melodrama, he'd appear, sit at the opposite end in his immaculate suit, and watch the screen with the focus of a man in a shareholder meeting. One evening, deep in an episode, mouth glossy with fried chicken grease, I felt a gaze burning into the side of my face. I turned. He wasn't watching the television at all. He was watching a drop of grease slide slowly down my chin, like it was the single most fascinating thing he'd witnessed all week. I clutched the box to my chest, immediately suspicious. I am not sharing my chicken. Roman, you're a billionaire. Order your own overpriced dinner. He blinked, a faint flush climbing his neck, and looked away, but he didn't leave the sofa. That night, the nightmares came back with a vengeance. I woke gasping, choking on a scream, chest crushed under invisible weight. The bedroom door flew open before I'd even finished sitting up. Roman, hair mussed, pajama shirt half undone, none of his usual polish intact, crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled my trembling body against his chest. "Breathe with me," he said, voice raw. "In for 4. Hold out. Come on, Dean." He pressed his hand flat over my racing heart, using his own steady pulse as an anchor, and I sobbed weakly into his shirt while he talked me down from the edge of a panic attack that belonged to a childhood I'd only just inherited. When my breathing finally leveled, I tried to pull back, suddenly aware of exactly how close we were. "I'm fine. You can go." "No." His grip didn't loosen. He pulled the blanket over both of us and settled his weight onto the mattress, forcing my head against his shoulder. "I'm staying in case it comes back. This is completely off script, Roman." "Sleep," he murmured, already exhausted. I lay there, paralyzed, watching the sharp corporate edges of his face soften in the dim light into something devastating. My heart started thudding for an entirely different reason than the nightmare. "Oh no," I thought, a cold sweat breaking out. "This is a trap. Falling for the male lead is a one-way ticket to a psychiatric hold." I turned my face pointedly toward the wall and spent the rest of the night trying and failing to ignore the warm weight of his arm around my waist. The following weeks fell into a rhythm neither of us acknowledged out loud. Roman started coming home earlier and earlier, until earlier quietly became on time, every time, without fail. He learned, without ever asking directly, that I liked my coffee too sweet to be considered coffee anymore, that I couldn't sleep without some kind of background noise, and that I flinched, just slightly, just for a fraction of a second, whenever a door slammed too hard, a leftover reflex from a childhood that had taught this body to treat loud noises as a warning sign. He never mentioned noticing any of it. He just quietly stopped letting doors slam. I noticed things about him too, in turn, whether I wanted to or not. The way he rubbed his left temple exactly twice before starting a difficult phone call. The way his shoulders dropped half an inch the moment he crossed the penthouse threshold, like the suit of armor he wore to the office, physically weighed less once he was home. The way he'd started leaving his tie loosened at dinner instead of perfectly knotted, a small, deliberate softness he hadn't allowed himself before I showed up eating fried chicken on his sofa. "You're staring," he said one evening, not looking up from his tablet. "I'm cataloging," I said. "For research purposes." "What kind of research?" "Villain research," I said, entirely straight-faced. "I need to know your weaknesses in case I decide to stage a hostile takeover of your snack cabinet." He didn't even glance up, but the corner of his mouth twitched. "The chips are in the 3rd drawer. Try the ones in the blue bag. Marcus makes them from scratch." I stared at him for a long moment, genuinely thrown that he'd answered the joke sincerely instead of ignoring it the way the old script-perfect Roman Ashford would have. "You're supposed to be terrifying," I told him. "I'm told I still manage it," he said, finally looking up, something warm and amused in his eyes. "Just apparently not to you. It should have alarmed me more than it did. How easily those small domestic moments were stacking up into something that felt suspiciously like a life. I kept telling myself it was reconnaissance. I kept telling myself a lot of things that month that turned out not to be entirely true. The confrontation I'd been dreading came the next afternoon in his study over a glass of wine I refused to drink on an empty stomach. "Got any actual food?" I asked, pushing the wine away. "Chips, leftover pizza, anything that didn't cost more than my old rent," he sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're entirely unrefined. How did you survive before you met me?" "By being hungry," I said flatly. The room went quiet in a way I hadn't intended. His hands stopped mid-motion, his eyes dropped to my wrists, still thin, still a little too fragile, and then to my complexion, the leftover evidence of a lifetime of malnutrition I was currently trying to eat my way out of. "Your father," he started, quieter now, all the corporate edge gone. "My assistant looked into your background last week. He told me about the debt, the abuse, the starvation, the tragic backstory reveal. Right on schedule." I waved a hand, forcing a light laugh. Don't lose sleep over it, boss. It's ancient history. Your 50 grand did wonders, honestly. The loan sharks were so thrilled to get paid in full they thanked me and gave me a box of rice cakes on the way out. Surprisingly polite criminals when you're not empty-handed. He didn't laugh. He leaned forward, closing the careful one-seat gap I'd established between us, his frame suddenly uncomfortably close. Why didn't you tell me? His voice had dropped low and intense. You could have used it, cried. Made me pity you. Why play the greedy mercenary instead? Because sympathy is a terrible currency, I said, meeting his eyes and letting the joke drop from my voice entirely. It runs out fast, and once it's gone, it curdles into irritation, or pity, or both. But a contract, mutual, greedy, with clear boundaries, that's dependable. You always know exactly what you're getting with me, no emotional strings. He studied me like he was trying to see straight through to something I hadn't shown him. Then he reached out, wrapping a warm hand around my wrist. Not painful, but absolutely unyielding. What if I want the strings? I stood so fast, the stool nearly went over. Whoa, hold on, Tiger. I raised both hands, backing up a step. Did you hit your head in a merger this morning? You hate emotional strings. You hired me specifically to avoid them. Don't rewrite the script now, Roman. He rose slowly, towering over me with an entirely different aura than the one I'd signed up for. Not cold anymore, but dangerously intrigued. The script can be changed. Not by me, I said, retreating toward the door. He let out a soft, breathy laugh. Too warm. Too charming, way too attractive for my continued sanity. You really are infuriating. Oh no, I thought, heart slamming against my ribs like a trapped bird. This isn't how the story is supposed to go. He's supposed to look at me with disgust. Elliot, wherever you are, please buy a plane ticket. Come save me from this deranged billionaire. I spent the rest of that evening locked in my room, doing the mental equivalent of pacing a hole in the carpet. I ran through every version of this scene I could remember from the novel. The ones where Roman was supposed to be cold, dismissive, counting down the days until Elliot's return gave him a graceful exit. Not one of those chapters had prepared me for a man who looked at me like I was the twist he hadn't seen coming. I didn't sleep well that night, and it had nothing to do with nightmares this time. As the old saying goes, ask and you shall receive. Exactly 2 weeks later, the actual plot of the novel finally clawed its way back into motion, with all the subtlety of a wrecking ball. The Ashford Foundation's Spring Gala was the kind of event that made my working-class soul want to hide under a table. Soaring ice sculptures, a violin quartet nobody could hear over the champagne fizz, the absolute cream of society draped in silk and diamonds and old grudges. I was mid-performance, leaning theatrically against Roman after spilling fruit juice on my shoe, loudly demanding a replacement pair of Italian loafers as compensation for my emotional distress. In any earlier version of the last few weeks, he'd have scoffed. Instead, he pinched my cheek fondly. The whole collection tomorrow. Stop pouting. Before I could process how unsettling his tenderness had become, the ballroom's double doors swung open and the entire room went quiet. A young man walked in, and it genuinely felt like the lighting adjusted around him. Pristine white tuxedo. Soft brown hair, the kind of gentle, luminous face that made strangers want to protect him from traffic. Elliot Hale had arrived, the actual protagonist of Beautifully Ruined, 11 years and one dramatic entrance late. I let out a quiet breath of relief. There's my ticket out. I turned to watch Roman's reaction, waiting for the novel-defining moment, the part where his heart supposedly stopped, where he remembered a cherry blossom promise and realized the last month had been a meaningless sham. Roman wasn't even looking at the door. He was looking at me with the kind of quiet, settled contentment I did not have a category for. Hey, look, I said, elbowing him hard enough to leave a mark. Who is that? He's absurdly good-looking. He glanced toward Elliot for exactly 1 indifferent second and turned right back to me, eyebrow raised. Am I not better looking? Roman. Isn't that your childhood friend? The one who moved away 11 years ago? So, he said, entirely unbothered. Before I could shake some sense into his billionaire skull, Elliot spotted us and drifted over with the kind of effortless grace you can't buy, only inherit. Roman? His voice was warm, almost musical. It's been so long. Welcome back, Roman said, polite. Cold, the exact tone he used on mid-level quarterly reports. A flicker of hurt crossed Elliot's face before his gaze slid over to me, and something in his expression shifted entirely. His eyes widened, color rose in his cheeks. He stepped past Roman like the man wasn't even there. And who is this? His voice went soft, almost breathless. This is a face the rumors did absolutely no justice to. I'm Dean, Roman's boyfriend. He didn't shake my hand. He took it in both of his, thumb brushing my knuckles, gaze locked onto mine with an intensity that felt deeply inappropriate for a protagonist meeting his rival. Dean, he murmured. What a beautiful name for a beautiful problem. Excuse me. Roman's voice dropped several degrees below freezing. He stepped between us before I could blink, pulling my hand free of Elliot's grip and tucking me neatly behind his back, like a man shielding treasure from a dragon he hadn't expected to show up. Keep your hands off my boyfriend, Elliot. Elliot, entirely unbothered, tilted his head with a slow, needling smile. Your boyfriend? Please, everyone in this room knows you don't do relationships, Roman. This whole arrangement is a well-dressed excuse to dodge your parents. Which means Dean is entirely fair game. He reached around Roman's shoulder, retrieved my hand, and pressed a slow kiss to my knuckles before I could yank it back. What is happening? I screamed internally. Elliot is supposed to love Roman. Roman is supposed to love Elliot. Why are they circling each other like two apex predators arguing over the same steak? And why am I the steak? Careful, Roman warned, his hand finding my waist with a grip tight enough to leave a mark. Cross this line and I'll dismantle your family's shipping contracts before sunrise. Don't test me. We'll see, Elliot said smoothly, eyes sliding to my thoroughly panicked face with a wink. Lovely meeting you, Dean. I imagine we'll be seeing quite a lot of each other. He turned and walked off, radiant and infuriating in equal measure. Roman spun to face me, gripping my shoulders. Don't talk to him. Don't look at him. You're mine. Before I could respond, a cluster of investors swept him into an unavoidable business conversation. I took the opening and slipped toward the open bar, badly in need of a drink, or 5. I want to be clear that none of this was part of the plan. The plan, the one I'd built my entire second chance at life around, was to stay detached, stay uninvolved, and let the story's actual romance sort itself out without my interference. It had not accounted for the specific, dizzying vertigo of watching two men who were supposed to be soulmates glare at each other over my head, like I was the last parking spot at a crowded mall. It had definitely not accounted for the small, treacherous relief I'd felt, in that split second before Roman stepped between us, a feeling I told myself firmly was purely strategic. Elliot complicating things early was bad for my exit timeline. That was all it was. That was absolutely, 100%, all it was. An hour later, I was thoroughly, spectacularly drunk, the combined result of a collapsing storyline and an unlimited supply of premium cocktails. Hi again, said a voice at my ear. I turned, blinking, to find Elliot leaning against the bar, all soft angles and easy charm. Your boyfriend looks busy with those investors. Want to get some air with me? Before my very compromised judgment could raise an objection, his hand closed gently around my wrist, guiding me toward the exit. I stumbled along, patting his cheek admiringly. Wow, I slurred, giggling. You're really pretty, like an actual angel. He's not going anywhere with you, Elliot. That last part hadn't come from me. Roman's voice rolled across the ballroom like distant thunder. Before I could blink, I was hauled backward into a chest as solid as a wall, one arm locked around my waist so tight I could barely breathe. His eyes had gone dark with something that had nothing to do with corporate composure. Without a word, he threw me over his shoulder like a very expensive sack of potatoes, and marched straight out of the gala, ignoring every gasp, whisper, and camera flash in his wake. Put me down, you brute, I yelled, fists thumping weakly against his back. I'm a premium employee. This is a labor violation. He said nothing. He deposited me in the back of the car, climbed in after me, and locked the doors. The silence on the ride home was suffocating. My survival instincts, apparently on vacation, sent me crawling across the seat to poke his tense cheek. Why so angry, Mr. Billionaire? I giggled. Smile a little, makes you less scary. His breath caught. He caught my hand, eyes burning with something dangerously close to desire. The moment the penthouse door clicked shut, he didn't hesitate, scooped me up bridal style, ignored my half-hearted protests, and carried me straight into the master bathroom, stepping into the walk-in shower, fully clothed and turning the water on cold. Sober up, Dean, he ordered, voice shaking as the water soaked through his dress shirt. He pinned me gently against the tile. You're supposed to be my boyfriend. Why did you touch his face? Why did you call him beautiful? The cold water was doing its job, clearing the fog from my head fast. I looked up at him, soaked, his white shirt gone transparent, water tracing down a jawline that had no business being that sharp, and every ounce of restraint I'd been rationing for weeks simply gave out. I leaned in and kissed him. He froze for exactly 1 shocked second before a low sound broke loose in his throat, and then his hands were braced against the tile on either side of my head, kissing me back with a force that erased every rule I'd made for myself. My fingers tangled in his wet hair. His hands slid to my hips and lifted me half off the floor. The contract, the plot, my entire well-organized survival plan. All of it dissolved into steam. We didn't stay in the shower long. What happened after, under the silk sheets of his enormous bed, is not something I'm putting in writing, but I will say I stopped surviving and started, for the first time in 2 lifetimes, genuinely living, tangled up in the arms of the man I'd spent weeks running from. Sunlight through floor-to-ceiling windows, the distant hiss of a running shower. I sat up, silk sheets pooling around me, and caught sight of the very obvious evidence decorating my collarbone. "Dean, you absolute idiot," I groaned into my hands. "You broke rule number 1, panic 1. I threw on the first clothes I found, grabbed my keys, and fled the penthouse before Roman had even turned the water off. Only once I hit the crowded street did the flaw in my escape plan become obvious. I had nowhere to go, no friends in this world, no family, no safety net beyond the one I'd just run away from. I walked for hours, bought a $2 coffee, and tried to talk sense into myself on a random sidewalk. "It's a modern world," I muttered. "One-night stands are normal. It's a Tuesday for consenting adults." It meant nothing. Nobody confessed undying love. I nodded firmly, willing it to be true. It was a drunken mistake fueled by cocktails and a wet dress shirt. Roman can still end up with Elliot like the story wants. I still get my payout and my exit. Even as I said it, some quieter part of my brain pointed out, unhelpfully, that Elliot had spent the entire gala flirting with me, not gazing longingly at Roman across a crowded room the way the novel had always promised. The plot, I was beginning to realize, had derailed weeks ago. I was just the last one still pretending the tracks were intact. The thought of finally leaving Roman for good sent a sharp, unmistakable ache straight through my chest, and this time I knew with total certainty it wasn't a phantom feeling borrowed from the original Dean. It was entirely mine. I'd spent both of my lives running alone, never letting anyone close enough to matter. The original Dean had been just as isolated, but the last month living with Roman had quietly rewritten something in me. I'd gotten used to being taken care of. Used to shared meals, ridiculous soap operas, arms around me in the dark keeping the nightmares at bay. But being alone with a healthy bank account still had to be better than being alone and heartbroken. If the plot could still theoretically correct itself, I couldn't afford to fall the rest of the way. I told myself that all afternoon, right up until it stopped sounding convincing even to me. When the sun went down, I went back, mostly because my phone was still on the nightstand, and I had, in fact, nowhere else to go. The penthouse was dark and silent when I stepped inside. Roman sat perfectly still on the sofa, and the moment the door clicked shut, his eyes found me through the dark. "Where were you?" His voice wasn't angry, it was hollow, raw. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, breathing hard. "No phone, no wallet, you just vanished." His hands closed around my arms, trembling slightly. "Do you have any idea what I was about to do?" I almost called security, the police. I thought you were gone. This was the moment to play it cool, detached, modern. "I'm sorry, I should have left a note," I said, forcing my voice flat. "Also, let's just forget last night happened, Roman. Mutual drunken mistake. Let's stick to the contract." His eyes went dark with something furious. "A mistake." His grip tightened, pulling me closer. "You want to forget kissing me in that shower? Forget being held? Forget saying my name like that? Because I can't, and neither can you. You need to take responsibility." Take responsibility? The dam broke. Tears welled up before I could stop them. "The entire reason you hired me is because I'm not the person who's supposed to take responsibility for anything, Roman. Did you forget your parents despise the sight of me? Did you forget I'm just the money-hungry rat you're paying to be here?" He flinched like I'd struck him, the memory of his own words in that first study meeting clearly landing all over again. "Dean, I'm sorry. I never should have said that." My voice cracked as the tears kept coming, some borrowed sorrow from the original Dean, some entirely my own. "I'm a temporary fixture in your life. We both know how this ends. You'll eventually end up with someone who actually fits, someone like Elliot, and I'll be alone again. I used to be fine with alone. I hated needing anyone. But you keep messing with that." I don't want to get greedy for something that was never mine to keep." Before I could get another word out, he pulled me hard into his chest, hand cradling the back of my head, rocking me gently while I cried harder than I had in either of my lives. "You are not a temporary fixture," he said fiercely against my ear, voice thick. "And I will never let you be alone again. Never." After that night, whatever had been simmering between us stopped pretending to be professional. We kept our routines, but I found myself noticing him constantly, the way his expression softened whenever I entered a room, his exact preferences at dinner, the rare, small smile he seemed to save just for me. I didn't hear a single word from Elliot for months, and I had a strong suspicion Roman's considerable corporate reach had something to do with that. I did, however, notice the gifts. Beautifully wrapped packages addressed to me that the household staff intercepted and shredded before I ever laid eyes on them. Roman's jealousy, it turned out, was a genuinely terrifying force of nature. It caught up with us eventually, the way these things do, and not just from Elliot's direction. The first sign that something had genuinely shifted, rather than just softened, came at the Ashford Group's annual holiday reception, a stiff, over-catered affair held on the top floor of the company's headquarters, the kind of event I'd been dreading since Roman first mentioned it over breakfast. "You don't have to perform anything tonight," he'd said, adjusting my collar with more care than the gesture strictly required. "It's mostly board members and division heads. No press, no parents." "So what exactly is the assignment?" "Just be yourself," he said. Like that wasn't the single most alarming instruction anyone had given me since I'd woken up in this body. I discovered, over the course of that evening, that being myself in a room full of Roman's colleagues produced a very different reaction than I'd expected. I'd braced for the same barely concealed horror his parents' circle always managed. The tight smiles, the whispered commentary, the sense of being catalogued as a scandal in real time. Instead, a woman from the legal department cornered me by the hors d'oeuvres within the first 10 minutes and asked, with what appeared to be genuine urgency, whether it was true that I'd gotten Roman Ashford to leave the office by 6 o'clock on a Tuesday. "Guilty," I admitted. "We've been trying to get him to do that since he made partner," she said, visibly moved. "Whatever you're doing, please continue doing it." A junior analyst told me, in a conspiratorial whisper by the coat check, that Roman had apparently stopped scheduling calls after 7 in the evening entirely, a policy shift the entire junior staff had unofficially nicknamed the Dean Rule, and had started actually taking his allotted vacation days instead of stockpiling them as a monument to his own workaholism. "He used to be terrifying," she said. "He's still terrifying, don't get me wrong. Just terrifying with better boundaries now." I found Roman by the window a while later, deep in a conversation with a man I recognized vaguely from the company's press releases as the head of the shipping division. He excused himself the moment he saw me approaching and slid an arm around my waist. The easy, automatic gesture of someone who'd stopped thinking of it as a performance months ago. "Your entire staff has opinions about our relationship," I told him. "Did you know that? I'm aware. They think you've gotten nicer." "I have gotten nicer," he said, entirely without irony. "It's a fairly recent development. I can point to the exact week if you're curious. Please don't. I'll get insufferable about it." He huffed something close to a laugh and pulled me a little closer, resting his chin briefly against the top of my head in a gesture that would have made the old, script-perfect version of him break out in hives. Across the room, his mother watched us with an expression I couldn't quite place. Not the practiced disdain from the charity gala, not quite approval either, but something caught somewhere in between. Like a woman recalculating a math problem she'd been certain she'd already solved. She didn't approach us that night. She didn't need to. The math would catch up with her soon enough. What struck me most, walking out of that reception with my hand in Roman's, wasn't the staff gossip or his mother's grudging reassessment. It was the quiet, almost embarrassing realization that I'd stopped performing entirely without noticing the moment it happened. Somewhere between the fried chicken and the panic attacks and the shower confession neither of us had planned. Playing Roman Ashford's inappropriate boyfriend had turned into something that didn't require a script at all. I mentioned as much in the car on the way home, mostly to see what he'd say. "When did you figure that out?" he asked, watching the city lights slide past the window. "Somewhere around the 4th time you sat through an entire episode of a soap opera you clearly hate, purely to be in the same room as me. I don't hate it, he said, entirely too seriously. The mother-in-law storyline has genuine narrative momentum. You've been paying attention. I pay attention to everything that matters to you, he said, like it was the simplest fact in the world, and I had to look out the window for a long moment before I trusted my own voice again. The summons came on a Thursday, delivered by a stiff-backed assistant who clearly hated being the one holding the envelope. Roman's parents were requesting, which in that family meant demanding, a private dinner at the Ashford estate. No staff mentioned in the invitation. No excuses accepted. You don't have to come, Roman said that night, jaw tight, as he read it over again at the kitchen island. I'll handle them. Absolutely not, I said, stealing a piece of toast off his plate. If your parents are cooking up something, I want a front row seat. Also, free dinner. I'm contractually obligated to show up for free dinner. He didn't smile at that the way he usually did. That should have told me something. The estate, when we arrived, looked exactly like I'd imagined. A house built to intimidate rather than to be lived in, all marble and hedges trimmed into submission. His mother greeted us at the door with a smile so tight it looked painful, and led us into a dining room set for 4. The 4th chair was already occupied. Dean, Roman's mother said sweetly, gesturing to the elegant young woman seated there. This is Genevieve Whitmore. Her family owns half the ports on the eastern seaboard. We thought it would be lovely for you two to get acquainted, since you and Roman clearly won't be permanent. Genevieve, to her credit, looked almost as uncomfortable as I felt. She gave me a small, apologetic shrug over her wineglass that said, very clearly, I did not sign up for this either. Roman's fork hit his plate hard enough that the sound cracked across the room like a gunshot. Mother, it's just dinner, darling, she said, entirely unbothered. We simply think it's important for Dean to understand his situation clearly. Contracts end. People move on. It would be cruel to let him get too attached to something temporary, wouldn't it? I felt the old, familiar burn of the original Dean's grief flicker somewhere under my ribs, the specific ache of being talked about like furniture that was due to be replaced. I didn't let it show. I'd had a great deal of practice not letting things show. Mrs. Ashford, I said pleasantly, reaching for my wine, I appreciate the concern, truly, but I've read the contract more carefully than anyone at this table, including your son. And it's my professional opinion that you're about 11 weeks too late. She blinked. Excuse me? I renegotiated my terms months ago, I said, smiling sweetly right back at her. Permanent position, full benefits. I believe the technical term your son used was lifetime tenure. I glanced at Genevieve. No offense to you at all. You seem lovely and frankly a little too smart to be sitting through this. But I'm not going anywhere. Roman's hand found mine under the table, gripping it like a lifeline. His mother's mouth opened and closed twice before anything came out. We'll discuss this later, Roman, his father said stiffly, though the fight had visibly gone out of him. There's nothing to discuss, Roman said. Standing so abruptly, his chair scraped loudly against the marble. I've told you both, repeatedly, that this is not up for negotiation. If you'd like to keep pretending otherwise, you can do it without us at the table. He pulled my chair back before I'd even finished my wine, and we left Genevieve Whitmore alone, with 2 extremely stunned billionaires and a very expensive, very untouched roast. In the car afterward, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding for an hour. Well, that was fun. 10 out of 10, would ruin another family dinner again. Roman didn't laugh. He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window with his jaw still tight. I'm sorry, he said eventually. You shouldn't have had to sit through that. Hey, I nudged his knee with mine. I've survived worse than one bad dinner and a side of passive-aggressive matchmaking. I'm not going anywhere, remember? I believe I have that in writing now. That was the night, I think, that something in him finally, fully cracked open. The last piece of armor he'd been keeping in reserve in case I turned out to be temporary after all. 48 hours later, his parents summoned him again, this time alone, for what he only ever described, afterward, as settling things properly. He came home from that second meeting looking like a man who'd just rewritten the terms of his entire life. For those 48 hours, the penthouse had felt enormous and cold, and I'd found myself wandering the empty rooms, unsettled by how thoroughly my life had reorganized itself around one man's presence. I sat down and pulled up my banking app out of habit. Even without the eventual breakup payout the story had always promised me, Between my allowance and what was left after clearing every last cent of inherited debt, I had more than enough saved to walk away tonight. A cozy one-bedroom downtown. No high society drama, no tyrannical in-laws, zero risk of heartbreak. It should have thrilled me. For 2 lifetimes, financial freedom had been the entire point of my existence. Instead, staring at listings on my phone, a strange hollow feeling settled in my chest. The quiet apartment didn't look like freedom anymore. It looked like a very well-decorated cage. The bedroom door opened. Roman stood there, tie undone, clearly exhausted from travel, and his eyes went straight to the real estate app glowing on my screen. His jaw locked so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. He crossed the room in 2 strides, breathing ragged. "What are you looking at, Dean?" "Apartment listings," I said quietly. "I've paid off every dollar of debt. I have enough saved to start over completely. I don't even need the breakup payout anymore. I'm financially free. I could leave right now." His eyes went wild with panic. He grabbed both my hands. "If you think for 1 second I'm letting you walk out of my life, you are catastrophically mistaken." His voice cracked. "I don't care about the contract. I don't care about the plot you keep insisting we're stuck inside. Tonight, I told my parents flat out, accept you, or I liquidate my shares and walk away from the company entirely. They accepted. They had to." He dropped to his knees in front of me, forehead against my lap, hands trembling around my waist. "I want you, Dean. I want to marry you. I want an entire life with you. You cannot leave me alone in the dark. I won't survive it." I looked down at his bowed head and felt something warm fill every corner of me. I threaded my fingers through his hair, smiling through sudden tears. "I'm not going anywhere, you enormous idiot," I whispered. "I realized today that a quiet apartment alone sounds unbearably boring. So listen carefully, Mr. Ashford. The contract is officially void. Your employee is resigning from the position of fake boyfriend." He looked up, eyes wide with breathless shock. "Because pretending I don't want to kiss you every time you look at me has been doing genuinely terrible things to my weak, weak heart," I said, leaning down until our noses touched. "I'm applying for a permanent position instead. Lifetime tenure, full marital benefits, unlimited fried chicken. Take it or leave it." He let out a breathless laugh, pure and unguarded, and reached into his jacket for a small velvet box, sliding a ring onto my finger before pulling me down into a kiss that felt very much like a promise being kept. "I love you, Dean," he murmured against my mouth. "I love you too, you absolute mess," I whispered back. I'd spent 1 entire lifetime dying of exhaustion just trying to survive, and the beginning of this one treating Roman like a hazard I needed to avoid. Turned out he wasn't the trap, he was the exit. The wedding was, unsurprisingly, an event, though Roman had ruthlessly trimmed the guest list to people who actually liked us, rather than people who liked being photographed near us. His parents sat stiffly in the front row, having finally accepted that their son would burn the family empire to the ground before letting anyone mistreat me again. During the reception, I slipped out to the balcony for air, watching the sky shift toward twilight. "Congratulations, Dean," I turned. Elliot stood there, still absurdly elegant in a soft gray suit, leaning against the railing with a wistful smile. "Roman used every trick in his very extensive corporate playbook to keep me away from you these last months," he said, shaking his head with something like reluctant admiration. "Blocked my number, threatened my family's shipping contracts, had his security intercept every gift I sent. Truly a terrifying man in love." I laughed nervously. "He can be a little intense. Here's the part I imagine you never got to hear," Elliot said, and something shifted in his expression, the polished charm cracking just slightly. "I didn't come back for Roman, or the cherry blossom promise everyone loves to bring up. My family's shipping company was bleeding money for years, and the fastest fix on the table was marrying into old money, and Roman's name was at the top of that list. My parents packed my bags for me. I flew home already engaged to a plan I never agreed to." He huffed a quiet, humorless laugh. "Funny thing about walking into that gala expecting to play my part, I met you instead, and for about 5 minutes I actually let myself believe I could just take what I wanted for once, instead of what I was assigned. Turns out I understand your situation better than anyone in that ballroom ever could." I blinked, genuinely thrown. "You mean you were faking it too?" "In my own overdressed way." He smiled, softer now, more real than anything he'd shown me at the gala. "Roman was lucky, Dean. He found you first." He reached for my hand and pressed a light kiss to my knuckles. "For what it's worth, I hope whatever's waiting for me turns out to be half as real as what you two have. Get your mouth off my husband's hand, Elliot." Roman's voice cut across the balcony like a blade. He materialized beside me in an instant, gently but firmly detaching Elliot's hand from mine, one arm locking around my waist. "Relax, Roman," Elliot said, backing away with his hands raised, that easy smile returning. "I was just leaving. Take care of him. Both of you deserve it." He disappeared back into the reception, and for the first time, I watched him go without a single flicker of guilt or nostalgia. Just relief, for him and for us. "Let's go," Roman said, guiding me back toward the doors, entirely done sharing me for one evening. "The jet's ready. We're leaving for that island you keep talking about." I looked up at my husband, a deep, settled peace spreading through my chest. The nightmares had stopped weeks ago. Maybe they'd never really been about the past at all. Maybe they'd always been about the fear of being alone in the dark. Now, I had more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes, a husband who'd rewritten an entire novel's ending just to keep me, and a friend on the other side of that ballroom door who, against every villain arc odds, might actually turn out fine too. Not bad, I thought, genuinely and quietly amazed, for someone who died at a keyboard, furious about an unfinished web novel. The island Roman flew us to didn't have a name I could pronounce on the first try, which felt appropriate, given how little of my current life still resembled anything I'd planned for. Our villa sat directly over the water, all pale wood and open windows, with a private stretch of beach that Roman's security team had apparently vetted more thoroughly than most world leaders' motorcades. I spent the first morning simply standing on the deck in yesterday's shirt, watching the tide, absorbing the strange, quiet fact that nobody needed anything from me. No debts, no contract, no script to perform. "You're doing the thing again," Roman said, coming up behind me with 2 mugs of coffee, setting one in my hands. "What thing?" Looking like you're waiting for someone to take it away. I opened my mouth to deny it, then closed it again, because he wasn't wrong. Some habits, it turned out, outlived even the most generous plot twists. 2 lifetimes of learning that good things came with expiration dates weren't going to unlearn themselves just because I'd landed somewhere safe. "Old habits," I admitted instead, leaning back against his chest. "Give me a few decades, I'll get there." "I have a few decades," he said simply, pressing a slow, unhurried kiss to the top of my head like it was the easiest promise he'd ever made. "I intend to use every single one of them proving you wrong about the expiration date." We spent the week doing exactly nothing productive, which was, frankly, the most luxurious thing either of us had ever experienced. Roman, because his entire adult life had been scheduled down to the 15-minute increment, and me, because nothing productive had never once been financially available to either version of Dean who'd occupied this body. On the 4th night, sitting on the sand with a bottle of wine neither of us had touched much, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I almost ignored it. Curiosity won. "Ran into Genevieve Whitmore at a fundraiser last week," the text read. "Turns out she hates the shipping business as much as I hate being told who to fall in love with. We're having dinner Friday. Wish me luck. E." I laughed out loud, loud enough that Roman raised an eyebrow. "Elliot," I explained, turning the phone toward him. "Apparently, your mother's matchmaking dinner accidentally worked. Just not on the couple she planned." Roman read it, huffed something that might have been amusement, and took my phone long enough to type back a single line before handing it over. "Try not to ruin this one too." "No promises," Elliot wrote back within the minute. "Also, tell Dean he still owes me a dance at the next gala. Purely platonic. I've moved on to shipping Harris's." I showed Roman, half expecting the old possessive scowl. Instead, he just shook his head, something almost fond in it. "One dance," he said. "I'll be watching from very close by. Wouldn't expect anything less, Mr. Ashford." Later, once the sky had gone fully dark, and the only light left was the moon on the water, I lay back against his chest on the sand and thought, not for the first time, about the version of this story I'd read on my phone during those endless graveyard shifts in my old life. The one where Dean ended up broken, alone, and forgotten in a hospital bed, a cautionary footnote in someone else's happy ending. I'd been so certain, the night I woke up in this body, that the only way to survive this story was to refuse to be part of it. Stay detached, take the money. Get out before it could hurt me the way it hurt him. Turns out the actual trick had never been staying out of the story at all. It was staying in it on my own terms, rewriting the ending until it belonged to me. "What are you thinking about?" Roman asked, voice low against my hair. That I used to think financial freedom was the whole point of being alive, I said. Turns out I was only ever half right. What's the other half? I turned in his arms, close enough to feel his heartbeat, steady and familiar under my palm, the same rhythm that had talked me down from more than one nightmare, the same one I planned on falling asleep to for the rest of however many lifetimes I got. You, I said. Obviously, entirely, embarrassingly you. Don't let it go to your head, Mr. Ashford. He laughed, that rare, unguarded sound he still only ever gave to me, and kissed me like neither of us had anywhere else in the world we needed to be. For once, we didn't. Somewhere back in the city, I knew, the Ashford Group's board was still recovering from the news that its notoriously unattached heir had married the man his own parents had once tried to talk out of the family. Somewhere, a certain shipping heiress was probably fielding a very persistent, very charming phone call from a man who used to be a plot device and had recently decided to write his own story instead. Somewhere, a bathroom mirror in a tiny, run-down apartment that no longer belonged to either version of Dean stood exactly as cracked as the day I'd first stared into it, gripping a porcelain sink and cursing my terrible luck. None of that mattered anymore. I'd spent one lifetime running myself into the ground just to survive, and the first month of this one running from the very thing that ended up saving me. I wasn't running anymore. I didn't need to. The tide came in slow and steady against the sand, and Roman's heartbeat kept its same familiar rhythm under my palm, and for the first time since I'd opened my eyes in a stranger's body and declared, out loud, to an empty bathroom, that I wanted nothing but cash and freedom, I finally, completely, had everything I actually wanted instead. Turned out I got the ending after all. I just had to become part of the story to read it. And for once, I didn't mind at all that the ending had turned out to be nothing like the one I'd skimmed through on all those exhausted, bitter graveyard shifts in my old life. Okay, be honest with us in the comments. Were you Team Roman, or did Elliot secretly win you over too? Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so the next story lands right in your feed the moment it's ready. We read every single comment, so don't be shy down there.